We're going to be in Mark 15, and I want to begin reading in verse number 6 of Mark chapter number 15. This is after Jesus has already been betrayed by Judas. He's been handed over to the priest. The false trial has happened, and now he's been before Pilate. And now we see this scene in Mark 15, beginning in verse number 6. Now at that feast, he released unto them one prisoner, whomsoever they desired. And there was one named Barabbas, which lay bound with them that made insurrection, who had committed murder in the insurrection. And the multitude, crying aloud, began to desire him to do as he had ever done unto them. But Pilate answered them, saying, Will ye that I release unto you the King of the Jews? For he knew that the chief priests had delivered him for envy. But the chief priests moved the crowd, the people, that he should rather release Barabbas unto them. And Pilate answered and said again unto them, What will ye then that I shall do unto him whom ye call King of the Jews? And they cried out again, Crucify him. Then Pilate said unto them, Why? What evil hath he done? And they cried out the more exceedingly, Crucify him. And so Pilate, willing to content the people, released Barabbas unto them and delivered Jesus when he had scourged him to be crucified. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, Lord, I am thankful that you see a cross, that, Lord, you do not see us in our sin and in our shame, but, Lord, you see a cross and what Christ has done for us. Father, as we come to your word today, I pray and I ask that you would cleanse us of any sin in our hearts that would hinder us from hearing your word or from preaching your word. Lord, I pray that you would give us eyes to see. I pray you'd give us ears to hear. I pray that you would give us a heart to receive the truth of your word. And I pray that if there is someone here today that does not know Jesus, that you would save them by your grace. And we'll thank you and praise you for it in Jesus' name. Amen. Jesus and Barabbas. These are two names that do not belong in the same sentence together. Jesus is the sinless, perfect Son of God. He's the man that children ran to because of his kindness and said, I want to know this man. He's the man that lepers, the blind, the poor, the lame, the maimed, the harlots came to for salvation. He's the man that in just the public eye for only 3.5 years turned the world upside down. You got Jesus, sinless, perfect, righteous, holy in every possible way. And then you got Barabbas, an insurrectionist, which is really a local terrorist in that day, a murderer, a rioter, a robber, a man headed to capital punishment for the crimes that he had committed in the world. These are two categorically, totally different kind of men. You've got the sinless and the sinner. You've got the religious, or the righteous and the rioter. You've got the perfect and you've got a thief. Yet in Mark 15, verses 6 to 15, and in every gospel account, both Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, all of them account this story. We have a substitution occur where the robber, the liar, the murderer, the insurrectionist goes free and the righteous goes to the cross. This is a shocking story, if you will, as you may be familiar with it, but this is not a story we should read and be like, all right, that makes sense. This is one that should stun us. But before we get to it, let's set the stage a little bit for where we are in the crucifixion story. So before this, Jesus has been betrayed by Judas. He sold him for those 30 pieces of silver, kissed him on the cheek, handed him over to the Jews. The false trial has occurred, where they brought all of these witnesses together, and none of them could get their testimony to agree of why Jesus should be condemned. Until they finally got two, that they agreed a little bit, and they lied about Jesus and condemned him to the cross. He's been betrayed, falsely accused, imprisoned. This carpenter from Nazareth is now the most hated and reviled man in all of Jerusalem and Israel. Just a few days before this was Palm Sunday, and they cried, Hosanna! Worship the King of the Jews, and now they're going to cry, Crucify here. And Jesus was going to be crucified because there was a group of scribes and priests, the people that should have loved him, that wanted him crucified. You can preach a whole sermon in that, but we won't do that today. But the people that should have loved him wanted him crucified, but they wanted him dead, but they did not have the authority to kill him. They were under Roman authority, existing as a Roman province in this time, and they had to go to a greater authority. That's why Mark 15 begins by them taking Jesus to a man named Pilate in the morning. Straightway in the morning, verse 1, the chief priest held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council, and bound Jesus and carried him away and delivered him unto Pilate. Pilate was the governor, the procurator of this time, and for the Jews to accomplish anything, they had to hand him over to Pilate for judgment. Here, when they brought Jesus to Pilate, they brought an accusation against Jesus, and they said he's been perverting the nation. You see this in Luke's account. They said he's been claiming to be king. He's been telling people to not give tribute to Caesar. They brought, by the way, false lies, weren't they? They were lies, weren't they? Because don't you remember Jesus said to give tribute unto whom tribute is due? He even said give tribute to Caesar. But they are so bloodthirsty that they are lying about him and saying, this man, notice, he is somebody trying to take the throne of Rome, trying to take the spot of Caesar. And so they come to Pilate with this accusation. And notice what Pilate says in verse 2. He begins with a question. And Pilate asked him, art thou the king of the Jews? By the way, this is the only phrase Jesus says in this passage. And he answering said unto him, thou sayest it. Pilate says, are you the king of the Jews? They're claiming you're the king of the Jews. They're claiming you're the guy who said you're going to rule and reign. And Jesus says, you say it. He doesn't revile. He doesn't defend himself in any way. He just says, you say it. And then the chief priests in verse 3 accuse him of many things, but he answered nothing. They come and they accuse him of a whole bunch of things. Jesus is sitting there, Pilate is listening, and Pilate's like, I know y'all a bunch of envious people and you just want this guy dead for no reason, but he's there and he's listening and they're accusing him of many things, but do you notice how he answered nothing? Now let's think about this. If you are a criminal and you got a whole bunch of people accusing you, wouldn't you be trying to defend yourself? If you're an innocent man, wouldn't you be trying to defend yourself? But not Jesus. As Isaiah 53 says, he goes as a lamb silent to the slaughter, and we'll see that more later. But he answers nothing. So Pilate asked him again in verse 4. And Pilate asked him again, saying, answerest thou nothing? And behold, how many things they witness against thee. But Jesus answered nothing, so that Pilate marveled. Pilate's mind is blown by this. Pilate's a pagan. He's a wicked man. He goes down in history as a bit of a coward. But Pilate looks at this situation. He's like, this man has done no wrong. He's done no evil. In one gospel account, Pilate says, I find in him no fault at all. So here's where you're at in verses 1 to 5. You've got the Jews that hate this man named Jesus. They bring him to Pilate and they say, we want this man dead. He's a sinner. He's a heathen. He's an insurrectionist. We want him dead. And Pilate's there and he's like, this man's done no wrong. But they're so insistent on what will happen. But eventually, you don't have this here, but in another gospel account, he sends him to Herod, and Herod wants to meet Jesus. Then eventually Jesus gets back to Pilate, and now Pilate is going to present Jesus to the crowd for the final verdict, if you will. Because in verse number 6, as we're going to find out, this was the time of year around Passover when one prisoner would go free, and Pilate thinks it's going to be Jesus. He's done nothing wrong, and we're going to see that as we go. But here's the drama. Here's the tension where we are right now in the story. Here's the question. Is Pilate going to set a righteous man free, or will a guilty man go free? Will Pilate set the innocent free, or will a guilty man go free? You know, the story of the cross, from a human perspective, is a story of injustice in many ways, isn't it? Everything that happens in the end of the Gospels is like, this is wrong, this is sinful, this is wicked, they're lying, they're cheating, they're doing all of these things. And if that's all it was, it'd be a tragic story. But friends, may I remind you this morning that the story we're going to look at today and the story of the cross in the Gospels is far more than an injustice of a man that is falsely accused, falsely condemned, and falsely crucified. But it is the story of a great exchange happening. And that's what we see in this text as we look at these two men, Jesus and Barabbas. And I want to look at this in three parts today. And the final one's going to bring it all together. But first of all, I want you to see the innocent condemned as we begin reading again in verse number 6. The innocent condemned. Now at that feast, the feast of the Passover, he released unto them one prisoner, whomsoever they desired. So at this time, this was the custom that during the Passover there would be one prisoner. If there was somebody under rule and in chains, that whoever the people wanted, they'd let him go free. It would be kind of a gift to the Jews. They would let him go free if they desired him to be free at the Passover. It's time to release one prisoner. And then we meet one of the most famous prisoners they've got right now. Look at verse number 7. And there was one named Barabbas, which lay bound with them, that had made insurrection with him, who had committed murder in the insurrection. Barabbas is a heathen of the highest regard, if you will. He's a guy that if he did this today, he'd be on Fox News, he'd be on CNN, he'd be on C-SPAN, whatever it is, he'd be on Newsmax, he'd be on every single news resource saying, this guy is deserving of capital punishment. This guy deserves death. He was an insurrectionist. Now, we don't have this event occur in the Gospels. We don't have it recorded here, but there was an event where Barabbas and other men rose up against Rome. They rose up and they brought a whole bunch of people and they caused a riot. He was a political activist and he wanted Rome taken down. By the way, don't miss this. Barabbas was actually what they accused Jesus of being. They said Jesus is an insurrectionist. Barabbas actually was. Now hold on to that because we'll come back to that later. But Barabbas was a wicked man. He was even a murderer. Did you notice that? When this riot happened, he committed murder in it. This man was a murderer. And John tells us that his simple description of Barabbas is this. He was a robber. Now think of that. So, you know, there's a difference between a thief and a robber. A thief, when you're not home, right now at church, they could go to your house and steal something. Hopefully nobody does. You might be looking at your Ring camera right now to make sure nobody's at your front door. But a thief shows up when nobody's home and takes and steals. They'll come and get your TV or your diamonds or whatever. They show up to the bank when nobody's there. But what does a robber do? A robber shows up in broad daylight. A robber doesn't go when the credit union is closed. A robber shows up when the teller's right here and tells them, hey, give me your money when everybody's there. A robber shows up in daylight. In other words, here's the point. Barabbas is a heathen in all the ways. He's rose up against the government. He's murdered. He's stolen. He is a heathen in every way. He's a rioter, a murderer, a robber. In other words, Barabbas is a criminal in both the eyes of Rome, because he's coming against them, and in the eyes of the Jews. And even more so, Barabbas is a criminal in the eyes of God. He's a sinner. He's condemned before God. He is a very guilty man. And Mark wants us to see this before we see what happens next. Because in this text, the options are going to be, do you want Jesus or do you want Barabbas? And he wants us to know that the first option is a man that is a criminal. As I said earlier, everything they accused Jesus of being, Barabbas actually was. So what'll happen here? So notice what happens in verse number 8. The multitude crying aloud began to desire him to do as he had ever done unto them. This verse is simply saying this. The multitude comes to Pilate and they say, all right, it's that time of year. We want a prisoner to be set free. We want you to release one unto you. So Pilate's like, all right, this is my opportunity. You know, Pilate's a complicated individual, isn't he? Because it seems like he wanted in part to do what was right. He could see that Jesus didn't deserve to be condemned. So Pilate says this in verse 9. But Pilate answered them saying, will ye that I release unto you the King of the Jews? For he knew that the chief priests had delivered him for envy. Pilate's like, okay, a lot of times the crowd will think differently than the leaders do. Don't you know that's true even today? The leaders, they may think one thing and the rest of the people may think another thing. And Pilate thinks, okay, let me ask the crowd. Because he's like, I don't want to keep Jesus. He's not worthy to be condemned. Let me see if I can set him free. So he asked the crowd, will you release the King of the Jews to you? Because he knows the guys who handed him over were a bunch of jealous, envious men. They just didn't like Jesus. They were blinded in their rebellion. So he asked them, do you want an actual criminal or do you want an accused criminal? Here's where you are in the story. Do you want Barabbas or do you want Jesus? Think of it like this. Do you want Hitler or do you want Jesus? Do you want Dahmer or do you want Jesus? Do you want Epstein or do you want Jesus? Who do you want? That's the options before you. You've got a man that is known for wickedness or a man that in the eyes of everybody else was known for righteousness. So what happens? Well, as the leaders do, they come in verse 11, but the chief priest moved the people that he should rather release Barabbas unto them. They go throughout the crowd, and you can almost see them doing it right now. You can see them say, hey, you need to tell Barabbas. Tell him Barabbas. Tell him you want Barabbas. And the person's probably like, why would I want Barabbas? Dude's a murderer. He's a robber. But they say, tell him you want Barabbas to be released. And so they tell him that. And Pilate in verse 12 answered and said again unto them, what will ye then that I shall do unto him whom ye call the King of the Jews? He says, okay, what do you want me to do? Here's their response. And they cried out again, crucify him. Then Pilate said unto them, why? What evil hath he done? And they cried out the more exceedingly, crucify him. A massive crowd can be easily moved in their opinion. And here, this multitude of people turns into an angry mob very quickly. And Pilate asks, what do you want me to do with Jesus? And now they have blood in their eyes. This is an angry mob, and their response is very simply, crucify him. We want a public, humiliating execution. Crucify him. Pilate's like, why? What evil, what wickedness has he done? And again, more exceedingly, crucify him. Crucify him. You can hear their voices cracking from the fervor coming out of them. They're saying, give us Jesus. Crucify him. So here's what you have. Jesus is going to be crucified. Pilate's going to hand him over to be scourged, to be beaten. He's going to be crucified. The innocent man is condemned unjustly, wrongly, and wickedly. Now, before we see the bigger point in just a moment, I want you to notice that this is also the final stamp, if you will, of God's rejection of the people at this time. They rejected their king. Now, God's going to restore his people. I believe that. But here is them. They've had every chance to believe Jesus. They've had every opportunity to trust that man that came to save them and to rule them and to reign over them, and they say no. But there's an even bigger point here. You see, if this were just a human story, it would be an utter tragedy and injustice. But in the innocent man going free, so we see the innocent man condemned. We see, secondly, the guilty freed here. Notice verse 15. And so Pilate, willing to content the people, released Barabbas unto them and delivered Jesus when he had scourged him to be crucified. Pilate gives in. He knows Jesus has done no wrong, but the people, they can't be stopped. Pilate probably doesn't want to upset his higher-ups. He doesn't want to upset the leaders. He doesn't want to upset the people. So he says, okay, I'll give you Barabbas, and we'll send Jesus to be crucified. Jesus, notice this is what is happening here. Jesus is on his way to the cross, and the man who was headed to the cross walks out scot-free. Jesus, the man who was accused of rising against the Romans, and Barabbas was the man who actually did rise up against the Romans. Jesus never harmed a soul. Barabbas was a murderer. Jesus was a giver. Barabbas was a robber. Everything that Jesus was, Barabbas was the opposite. And yet, Barabbas goes out free, and Jesus goes to the cross. Now, if we stopped here, this is an insane story, isn't it? If you just saw this in a movie, this would be an insane story. The righteous man goes away in chains, and the wicked terrorist is set free to walk again. Barabbas was headed to a cross, but he walks out free. He's a guilty man, but he has the opportunity to go out and live as a free man. He is a wicked man, but he's set free as innocent. He's done a world of wrong, but the verdict of condemnation has been taken off of him. And his freedom is because of somebody righteous going in his place. This is an exchange of epic proportion. Barabbas, guilty, vile, unjust, a terrorist, a robber, a murderer, the chief of sinners. If he died, nobody would have cared. His parents probably wouldn't even have cared that much. They're probably like, that boy caused us a world of problem. I'm glad he's out of here. He was a chief among sinners, but now Jesus is going to the cross in his stead. Now, we don't know what Barabbas thought. We truly have no idea. But I can imagine Barabbas if he had any heart about him at all, would have thought, I was going to the cross, and now I'm a free man. Makes no sense. It's mind-blowing. It makes no sense. Do you realize that Barabbas was the one who was headed to the cross here? You see, he was a notorious criminal and was going to a very public death. And instead, Jesus will be crucified on Calvary. Now, let's think about this for a moment. I didn't really think about this until I was reading some this week, and the dots connected, and I about lost my mind in the coffee shop this week. Do you realize how many crosses there were on Calvary? There were 3 crosses. Who was Jesus between on Calvary? He was between 2 thieves. Do you realize? I didn't even know this, and I believe it makes sense to me, so I'm going to go with it this morning. The 2 thieves Jesus was crucified between, it is most likely that they were the companions of Barabbas. That they were his compadres in going against Rome and in robbing and in murdering and doing all of this stuff, that they were the guys that Barabbas went with. So Jesus was on the middle cross. Now, what was the middle cross for? It was for the person that was the highest criminal there. It was for the person that was worthy of the most public execution. So Jesus, between Barabbas' 2 friends, dies in Barabbas' place here. Here's the point, as one commentator said. Jesus was nailed to a cross originally intended for Barabbas. Jesus was nailed to a cross intended for Barabbas. Do you hear that this morning? The man on the middle cross was not supposed to be Jesus. The man on the middle cross was supposed to be Barabbas. It was supposed to be the criminal, the thief, the terrorist, the murderer, and instead it is the Son of God. Jesus was crucified where Barabbas should have been. He became Barabbas' place on the cross. Where the chief robber was, that's where Jesus was. Where the chief robber should have been, Jesus was there. Where the chief murderer should have been, Jesus was there. Where the chief insurrectionist would have been, Jesus was crucified there. Where the chief of sinners was, that is where Jesus was crucified. Here's the point. Jesus didn't just take the place of a man that was slightly wicked, slightly bad, slightly out of whack. He took the place of a man that was most wicked, that was most undeserving. Friends, can't you see it yet? If you can't, let me spell it out for you. This is what I've been trying to get to today. So we see the innocent condemned. We see the guilty set free. And what does it teach us? It teaches us, lastly, this is the point. Jesus was condemned for us so that we can be set free. Isn't this a snapshot of the whole point of what Jesus does in the crucifixion? There's a man who is wicked and vile, and yet Jesus goes in his place and he walks out free. By the way, isn't this a snapshot of the whole Bible? Adam, Eve, Judah, David, Rahab, Gomer, everybody in between. Jesus is the one that takes their place. The story of the Bible is that God sets free those who deserve death by a righteous one taking their place. And this is a snapshot. It's a microcosm of that. You see, why is this story ultimately here? It's here to tell us in the bigger picture that it wasn't just the cross that Barabbas should have been on. It was the cross that you and I should have been on. It was the cross that we deserve. You see, like Barabbas, we're worthy of death. Now, I hope you're not an insurrectionist this morning, but we can hand you over to some people if we need to. I hope you haven't murdered anyone, or I hope you haven't robbed from anyone. But regardless, we have all sinned against a greater authority. We have wronged not a government, not a people, but we've wronged the King of the ages. And like Barabbas, we are worthy of death. We've lied, we've lusted, we've cheated. We've had anger, bitterness, and envy. We've not loved God as we should. We've not loved our neighbor as we should. In our sin, we sat on death row, headed to a spiritual cross. But there is one without spot or blemish who steps in. Not because somebody said, I'm going to send you over, but because he said, I will go, and he takes our place. Now, we haven't talked about this much yet, but do you notice how Jesus does not say a word through it all? When they're crying, crucify him, he doesn't say, no, I'm not worthy of death. When they say, give us Barabbas, he doesn't say, no. You should take Barabbas. He's wicked. He's vile. He's a heathen. He goes silent. You remember what Isaiah said? In Isaiah 53, verse 7, he was oppressed. He was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shears is done, so he opened not his mouth. Jesus, as that suffering servant, goes to the cross without a word. Why did he do it? Because of what verse 6 says in Isaiah 53. All we like sheep have gone astray, and we have turned everyone to his own way. But the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. We are like this Barabbas, wicked and vile, but we get to walk out free as Jesus went to the cross in our stead. And isn't this glorious? Isn't it glorious that cross, like Barabbas, is the one we should have been on? It is the one that we deserved to be there. And dear saint, the longer we know him, the more our jaws should drop at this reality. The more we should be stunned by this, that we were headed to a place of judgment, yet Jesus takes our place and we get to walk out with not a scratch on us. We live and we walk in freedom. You see, what Barabbas experienced physically, we have experienced spiritually. Like Barabbas, we're guilty, we're worthy of death. But I want you to know this morning, if you don't know Jesus like Barabbas, you can be set free. Now, Barabbas got set free without anything knowing about it in his own part. But if you're going to be set free spiritually, you must trust in Jesus. Now, what's the whole point? Isn't this what Romans 5 tells us in verses 6 to 8? For when we were yet without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will some die, yet peradventure for a good man some would even dare to die. But God commendeth his love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. If you don't know Jesus, you are without strength, helpless. You got nothing to do. You got nothing to save yourself. You're like a little child trying to move a massive refrigerator on your own. You can't do it. You can't build up and get to where you need to be with God. Yet in the right time, he sent Jesus to die for the ungodly. And you say, that makes no sense. That's the whole point. It shouldn't make sense. Because did you notice what Paul said, and I just quoted and read that? Scarcely for a righteous man. In other words, it's rare for somebody want to die for somebody who's done no wrong. It's possible somebody may die for somebody who was a good person. But it's impossible for somebody to want to die for an ungodly person. Yet that is what Jesus has done. That is what the Father has done for us in Jesus Christ. He demonstrated his love for us and for you this morning, that even while you were a sinner, he died for you. You see, in this little snapshot of Mark 15, we have the greater picture of the gospel here. That the just dies for the unjust, and that through him we may be made right with God. He became sin for us, who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. You say this morning, if you're here and you don't know Jesus, you never trusted him, you see your sin, you see your shame, and you say, how can I be made right with God? Here's how. He took your place. The cross you were headed to, destined for, the judgment and hell and eternity that you were headed for, he took your place. So I ask you this morning, are you where Barabbas was? Are you spiritually on death row? Because spiritually, if you don't know Christ, you are. Because we've all sinned, come short of the glory of God, and the price we are to pay for that sin is death, as Romans tells us. Are you where he was? And if you are, then you must trust in Jesus. You may say, I'm a church member. I got baptized, but I know I don't know Jesus. Friend, you need to leave that at the door and come to Christ. If you're somebody here today and you don't know Jesus and you've been acting like you know Jesus for years and years and years, then friend, you need to leave that pride at the door and you ought to run to Christ this morning. You ought to fall on him. You ought to trust in him today. If you're here today and you feel like you've got a Mount Everest of sin, you're not somebody who's like, I feel kind of righteous, but I know I'm not. You're somebody who's like, I feel completely unrighteous and I got no place before God. You feel like I've got a Mount Everest of sin. Dear friend, I want you to know that His grace and mercy goes higher. You say, I've been piling up my sins for 20 years, for 30 years, for 40 years, for 50 years. It feels like I can't reach the pinnacle. Well, can I encourage you? Climb to the very top of the mountain of your sin. Get to the very peak. Get to the very Everest of your sin. And you will look at a mountain beside of you called the mercy of God, and it ascends far higher and far greater than you can imagine. You can pile up your sins almost to heaven, and yet the mercy and grace of God goes ever higher still. You may have 10,000 mountains of sins, but the Lord has 1,000,000 mountains of mercy that He can give you, and then some. Here's your choice this morning. Will you stay bound up and go to the cross or go to the death and the punishment that you deserve, or will you let Jesus take your place? He's standing and He says, come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. It doesn't matter what you've done. The reason it's Barabbas is so that we will know it does not matter what we've done. Jesus stands open arms, ready for you to come. So will you come to Him today? Let's pray. Father, oh Lord, I thank You for this gospel. Lord, it is the sweetest, most glorious news that we have today and every day. Lord, I see myself as that Barabbas, unworthy of life and worthy of death. Lord, I'm thankful that You have taken our place. Lord, if there is someone here today that does not know Christ, I don't care if they're a church member. Lord, I do not care if there's somebody who has a bad background. I do not care who they are or what they've done. I pray that You would draw them to saving faith. That You would give them eyes to see and ears to hear. God, do what only You can do. We'll praise You for it in Jesus' name.